have to say I have really been enjoying all the Christmas lights that are out around town recently. Have you all been driving around, just kind of taking it all in? It is such a joy to just make my way up and down the streets at night and see all the festive colors lighting up the dark. I love them all. You know, in some way I feel like it connects me to this deep human impulse that has often existed in places where the day's length changes dramatically throughout the year, like the impulse to push back on the gloom with some kind of festival of light. You see that in so many different cultures in the extremes of the hemispheres. And I just love that when we put up lights, it's something that we do for ourselves, but also for each other. You know what I'm talking about? Like, we put up lights because we like them, but they're also clearly for other people to see and look at. Just sort of like a spirit of mutuality made visible in our community all the time. I think that's part of the magic. And I just want to say, officially, I can respect the many approaches that there are to this project. There's a lot of diversity of expression when it comes to the mutuality of the season of light. I can respect like the professional jobs that put perfectly evenly spaced lights around every roof line. Have you seen these? And no part of the strand is left over at the end, just hanging down. I have no idea how they do that, but I think that's great. I can also respect all the DIY creations with like lights wrapped around porch columns and front yard trees, and the common factor just seems to be how high the tallest person in that house could reach. I love that. I can appreciate also like just those nets of lights that are like tossed over front bushes, like a sort of little like spreadsheet of holiday cheer. And then there's the blow-ups and the fake birch trees and the projection lights that make it look like the whole house is swirling in snowflakes. And then there's my absolute favorite. A house a few blocks away from me has a huge lit-up jellyfish hanging in the tree. And it sort of slowly changes color. And I love that thing. Every night that I come home, I make a specific effort to go down that street to look at the psychedelic Christmas jellyfish. I mean, it's just... And I honestly have such goodwill toward my neighbors that put up that jellyfish for me to enjoy. Now, I have to say one thing that I don't see too much, at least in this neighborhood, which is something that's been a lot more common other places I've lived, is like a light-up presentation of the nativity scene. Like, I rarely see those. Maybe that's a comment about the secular nature of Portland. I don't know, but I know that in Boston especially, and also in Hawaii, everywhere you went, you see the Holy Family, like, arrayed in lights. And sometimes it was like the whole crew. It was like them plus the shepherds and the angels, and everybody was in there. In fact, there was a family that lived down the street from us in Somerville, Massachusetts, that had over time added all the secular Christmas personalities to the creche. So you like had the baby Jesus and the holy parents and the wise men, and then you had like Santa and Frosty and Mickey and Minnie Mouse and the Grinch, all in their Christmas finery. Which was like certainly strange, but I thought was also really cool, right? Like, look at this hugely diverse witness to the incarnation. But of course, most commonly, it was just the Trinity of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, right? Which I think is a scene that seems pretty recognizable to us because we're used to it. We're also used to seeing that kind of nuclear family depicted in art. But it really is a little bit radical if you think about it, especially like Joseph's presence there, who's like the stepdad to the divine before that word or identity even existed at all. And I have to say, I've always found Joseph to be such a fascinating, mysterious, and yet inspiring character. Like, one of my main disappointments about the gospel is that he fades so quickly from the story. I would just love to hear more from him about the life and ministry of Jesus from his unique perspective, but of course that's lost to time. I think it's important to note, though, that despite his like limited stage time, Joseph was a super important in the story of the Nativity, especially to the author of Matthew. And this is because for Matthew, Joseph is what helped set the story of Jesus in the context of the whole history of the people of Israel. So Matthew is written in the late 1st century for a group of Jewish Christians, followers of Jewish law, but also of the way of Jesus, folks who are just trying to figure out how to kind of reconcile and hold on to these two parts of their identity at the same time. And so for the author of Matthew, it's important to start Jesus' story by centering it within the story of Israel's history, showing that it's all part of one thing, God's story. Now, in fact, maybe you noticed that we read verses 18 to 25 of the first chapter of Matthew, but what would have been really fun would be to read the first 17 verses as well, because they list a whole genealogy of Jesus from Abraham to Joseph. But I have found in my illustrious career that most liturgists do not actually find it that appealing to be assigned 17 verses of obscure names from the Old Testament. You're welcome, Leslie. So just imagine and know that exists, or go back and read it later. I think it's still good to remember that that's the background for what we just read, right? Is the author saying, you're about to hear a story that goes back a long way. And when we think about that in the context of what Matthew's trying to tell us about Jesus, there is an invitation to start by remembering what that other story was all about. How after all that unfortunate business with the flood and the ongoing reality of human brokenness and sin, God got a little frustrated, and God chose, so the story goes, to be in relationship with one person in that person's family, Abraham. But it's very clear if you read back that far, this wasn't just so Abraham and his children would be free, would be saved on their own. It was really so that they could be a witness to the whole world about God's character and power. So all of that activity that comes in that story is not the activity of Israel for itself only. It was for the world to see the one true God. You know, like, maybe we could say it like this. God said, I've had enough of interacting with all of the people, all of these humans. They're just too much. They're very squirrely. They often don't do what I say. I'm going to kind of simplify it a little bit and talk to this one guy and his people. And then I hope that by talking to that one guy, others will actually start to listen in on that conversation. Does that make sense? That's kind of like the history of Israel without giving you a 1-hour lecture about the entire Old Testament. So if you read the genealogy, that again I want to affirm I did not make Leslie read, you will see that it includes all of that history, and it includes in it some of the most faithful leaders and reformers in that history, prophets of their own time who spoke truth and helped people to follow God's way. It also includes a number of women in unique, not totally conventional circumstances who helped to advance that history in some meaningful way. And on that list are also total tyrants and traitors and sinners and faithless sycophants who would and did do anything to protect their own wealth and power. It's all in there. And I do want to say, just as an aside, I've noticed that recently this history, understood this way, has come to serve as a reference point for the idea that God can work through imperfect people to advance God's purposes. This has proven to be a common citation that supports the idea it's okay for individuals who violate our commonly held moral principles to be our leader. But that's I don't maybe think that's what Matthew was trying to get at. It just seems important to say up here. The clear meaning seems to be about the fact that God's purposes, we've talked about this before, God's purposes can continue to unfold despite tyrannical, corrupt leadership, even though a side effect of such leadership is often great suffering for God's people. That's very clear if you want to read anything in the prophets. God's purposes can continue to unfold despite corrupt leadership, but the real encouragement of this story is that everyday people of faith, trusting in God's promises, is what truly moves God's intentions forward in this world. Everyday people trusting God's promises is what really moves God's intentions forward in this world. And I really want to keep that in mind, especially as we talk about Joseph. You know, Matthew wants to set Joseph at the end of this long history. And sometimes we take that to mean that he will inevitably do the right thing because he's part of this history. But the story is really set up to show that he has a choice. He could be one of the people who abandons their faith in a difficult hour, or he could lean into faithfulness in God and go on an unexpected journey to magnify the truth. And he chooses the latter. He chooses to go on this journey with Mary and support her in her calling. And in that choice, he adopts Jesus, not only into his own family, but into this whole complicated lineage of which he is a part. He knits Jesus' story, the beginning of it, into his own story. And so the story of salvation and reconciliation keeps going in Jesus' life and ministry. And I really think that if Joseph in his brief appearance gives us any encouragement for our own journey of faith, then it really lies in two things. Firstly, obviously, to trust in God's promises, acting in faith rather than fear. In Joseph's story, we see this painful reality that things don't always work out quite like we planned. I don't know if any of you have ever had that experience. Things don't work out like we imagined ahead of time. But if we can stay open, if we can stay curious, if we can stay faithful and attendant to our dreams, there is so much room for God to be at work. If we can listen and follow, we can be part of something unexpectedly beautiful and tender and important. So I think that's one invitation. Trust God's promises, acting in faith. But secondly, I think there's this invitation in Joseph's story just to refocus on this thing I think we know intellectually but don't always have in our heart about how we live not only for ourselves but also for others. You know, it's an opportunity to think about how we consider we are a part of something larger. We're a part of something that reaches back into the past and that casts a hopeful vision of the future. And as people of faith, as we go about our normal choices and challenges, we're meant to always keep that in mind. Keep in mind that what we do is not just for us. It's a witness for others also. And you know, this is Joy Sunday, so I want to really make clear, this is not invitation to martyrdom or anything, right? Like, I never have fun, I just have to just serve all the time. It's very difficult. And I think a lot of Christians take it that way. Like, I'm living for others. Look how suffering I am, you know, living for others. I don't think that's the invitation. I think we can live for ourselves and live for others at the same time. In fact, I think it can give us a sense of joy to be reminded that we're part of this big project, that we're part of this big family of humanity, and we have that solidarity with other people, and that we can live into it in acts of care and service and celebration. You know, it's like all those Christmas lights. They're there because they bring us joy, but they're also a witness of life and light to other folks. And I think if everyone were to live into that awareness a little bit more, it would be a very bright world, despite its challenges. And I really think maybe that's the main point of Joy Sunday. So let's put it like this as a question. How can we find ways to live our own joy, we could also say, embody our own freedom in a manner that also blesses others? Can we connect those things? How can we choose to live out our own story of faith and participate in the larger story of reconciliation at the same time, in a way that really is suffused with joy and gratitude and trust in God's promises? And I know that that's not easy work. I don't think it was easy work for Joseph. It's not easy work to face the uncertainties of this world or to make righteous decisions when the stakes are high. But I really do think that Joseph is a light for us, a role model who chose faith and trust, and who chose care and compassion, who chose the unconventional path to which God had invited him, that he might bless others by amplifying this witness that was about to happen in the resurrection. I really think that Joseph more than gained his place in a million nativities across the land, where it lights up and where the story of faith continued. And I hope that it is so also in our own lives in this season and going forward, that we might shine out the good news in a way that can bring joy, but also hope and peace to our world. And so I offer these words and that invitation in the name of the God who created, redeemed, and sustained us always.